Welcome to the Genealogy radio show, the radio show that's keeping you in the loop. And we air from beautiful Kilkee in County Clare, from Radio Corkabashkin, and we're delighted to have a lovely guest on our show today, Rita Davern, who's just been involved in the wonderful Burren Girl film. So we've a lot of talking to do about the Burren and also about the film. And welcome, Rita, to our show today.
Thank you, Lorna. It's a pleasure to be here, and hello, Kilkee. It's really, really fun to be with you.
And this is one of our first shows, listeners, because we're going to have a few more with Risha. And Risha, tell us about yourself.
Certainly. Well, I am a 73-year-old now, just recently, woman from St. Paul, Minnesota in the U.S. And I grew up with no understanding of my homeland or why I wasn't living there until I think it was about the 1960s. A cousin of my father started doing some family history research, and he went to Ireland and he went to our home farm there, two of our home farms there, and started doing some research. And my dad jumped on that bandwagon, and for the next, I think it's been ever since, we've been continuing that work. But what happened to me was I wasn't satisfied. I don't know, I got this like a dog with a bone, and I couldn't let it go, especially the pieces that nobody would talk about in my family. So I had an aunt and uncle that were very mysterious and no one would talk about them. And I know now, of course, that there was a mental health story there that was just shameful at the time. And so we weren't allowed to talk about it. But those two children were children of my immigrant grandma who came from Ireland. And so the more I learned, the more I wanted to learn. And her story led me back to the Burren. And that was what got me interested. And I was very determined to, even though the records are very few for women, in genealogy, and we had records for the men in our Davern clan back to, before recorded history, but never a story about a female. So I decided my grandma Anne would be the one that I would focus on and learn about as much as I could. And her story is pretty interesting on both sides of the Atlantic, but she's the one I followed.
That's great, Risha. And this story originates in the Burren and the Davern family. And just to tell you a little bit about the Burren for our listeners, it's in West Clare, and we have a 17th century account of Ludlow's accounts in the 17th century. Quote, after 2 days' march, without anything remarkable but bad quarters, we entered into the barony of Burren, of which it is said that it is a country where there is not water enough to drown a man, wood enough to hang one, nor earth enough to bury him, which last is so scarce that the inhabitants steal it from one another, and yet their cattle are very fat, for the grass growing in turfs of earth of 2 or 3 foot square that lie between the rocks, which are of limestone, is very sweet and nourishing. We got that from The Stranger's Gaze, Brian O'Dawley's edited work, and it's on the Clare Library website. So we have wonderful sources for the Burren, and it's known as a karst limestone area. So I'm going to ask some of our team here, Victor, Eve, Cian, Sarah, or Jack, to ask you some questions, Risha. So which one would like to go first?
What inspired you to make the film about your ancestry, Rita?
Thank you, Sarah. Well, in 2014, my niece came to me at Thanksgiving time. We were having a celebration over here, family get together. And she said, Rita, you have this entire story researched. You have a 1,200-year story of our family. you have to do something with this story. We can't let it get lost again. She said, why don't we make a film and I will help you? She's a photographer. So that sounded like fun to me. Of course, knowing nothing about what I was stepping into, but we decided to do this. So I started going to film classes and meeting people in the film community here where I live. And she and I went to County Clare in 2015 and started recording interviews with my friends and my distant relatives there. And that's how it all started.
And something like that would be really interesting to our viewers is what could you tell us just a little bit about the process in tracing your ancestral roots?
Yes, well, I even I call what I do genealogy by connection, because I'm not that good with computers. Ancestry.com, I can get a little ways with. More and more, of course, because I keep at it, but it doesn't come easily to me. But what I do find enormously fun and interesting and rewarding is to go and sit in the parlors and the kitchens of people in the Burren and talk with them and listen to them. And I've been doing that for 20 or more years. And that's mostly what I do. I got very dissatisfied with the tourist way of visiting Ireland. And I was tired of being a tourist and I wanted something more. And so I picked a place and I got to know some people and I kept building those relationships over decades, to the point where when I asked them in 2015 if they would go along on this journey with me making a film, and they just said, whatever you want, that's what we'll do. So we had relationships in place. And so they felt comfortable sharing their stories with me. And it's those stories that you see in Burren Girl, and they're precious. And they led me, I kept listening to their personal stories, and pretty soon I was able to piece together some of the bigger picture, the backdrop of their lives and their ancestors' lives. And then I started doing historical research. And then I put the two together, the family research and the historical research. And you'll see in the film a timeline toward the end. It's an animated timeline that shows the history of the Daverns against the history of Ireland and what was happening at the time. And it's so instructive, like it made sense of my family members' decisions when I learned what was going on in their neighborhood and their country at that time. So that's, I guess, the way I did it. Mostly stumbling through it because I didn't know what I was doing or why. I just followed the threads, you know.
During the course of your research, was there anything in particular that surprised you?
So much surprised me. I have to think for a minute here about one such surprise. Oh, well, we knew my grandma came over to Minnesota from Ireland in 1887, but that's all we knew. We didn't know who she came with. We didn't know why she came. We didn't know where she came from. And so discovering the answers to those questions was really profound for me. And I had to piece together, well, how do you get from Ireland to Minnesota in 1887? And how long did it take? And, you know, once you hit New York, then what? You know, how do you get the 2,000 miles further, you know? So it was a really big adventure. And one of my biggest highlights was the night I said to myself, I'm going to find out what ship she was on. I don't care how long it takes. I'm staying up all night. And so I looked at that month and that year for all the passenger steamships that were traveling from from Cove in Ireland to New York. And I stayed up till about 3 or 4 in the morning, and I read all the passenger lists. They're not alphabetical and they're handwritten. So I read and I read and I read and I read, and I found her. And at that point, I felt like I hit the jackpot, and I was ready to go on because she was real, her journey was real.
It's wonderful, and it's wonderful to see how you can use the passenger list to find your ancestry, and that you did such a dedicated job. And of course, it wasn't called Cove then; it was called Queenstown because it was still under British rule, and Kingstown would have been Dún Laoghaire. So when you come across Cove and Queenstown, they're one and the same place. And Risha, that's a fascinating, dedicated. And which boat did she come on? Do you know the name of it?
She came on the U.S.A. Germanic.
The Germanic. And
Yeah.
one of the things about a boat for our listeners is that it has a pedigree and a history. So when you look up the Germanic SS or whatever, you would find a history of that boat, and it would give you some clue as to whether it carried cargo, what type of luxury was there, was it a passenger ship, who owned the line, and so on. So it gives a very dedicated account of how you research your family history as well. And I know Eve wants to come in with a question. So Eve, what question have you?
So after, hearing your process of filming and everything, Rita, what would you pick out as being the most fun moment to film?
Oh my goodness, there was never a moment that wasn't fun, the filming part. Oh golly. I think it must be when you see the film, you will see a woman whose name is Mary Davern Peg. And she told me this story when I was visiting her once. It's called The Cream Story, and it's a sweet story about her growing up on the farm near Kilfenora, and how she would go out to where the milk was cooling in the stream near their house. Overnight, the milk would be put in the river to cool, and she would go up there and put her feet in that water. And she got the idea to go after some of the cream that sits on top of that milk. And so she did, and it became a habit. Every day she would go take some cream, and then she got caught. So it's a great story, and I still laugh every time I hear it. And it turns out it's people's highlight from the whole film is The Cream Story by Mary Peg. So
lovely, and it shows the resources of the time. And of course, we know milk to be pasteurized now, and from the 1960s you have creameries coming into Ireland, where before you wouldn't have had any produce for your milk so much, or excess. So an awful lot of food stuff was made from milk that stayed preserved a lot longer than ordinary milk does. So it dedicated the whole pastoral economy and the type of diet that the people enjoyed as well. It had a lot of influence on it. So Victor, have you a question for us today?
Yeah, no, I was just wondering, was there any anecdotes or funny stories you could tell us about your journey researching?
I can, I don't know about funny, but one of the things that I felt most rewarding was finding the 2 people that no one would talk about in my family, and actually going down to the health department and finding their records of what happened to them. And one was put in an institution at age 17. And so I learned all about him, and I feel like I put him back into our family tree, because his name, his funeral card didn't even have a name on it. I mean, there was so much shame attached to that. And I don't think there's too many of our families that don't have these stories if you go back far enough, and they're the people that nobody talks about. So I felt really good about my Uncle John and my Aunt Jane, and finding the details of their lives and actually talking to my relatives about them. And they're now back in the family tree, and I'm really pleased with that. But I do also have a story from Kilkee that was really key to the filmmaking. my niece Maria, as I said, came with me the first time to Ireland, and we had all these interviews set up, and we had just a really full 2 weeks planned. And she arrived sick. She was very sick with the respiratory bug, and she couldn't hardly get out of bed. And so I thought, oh my gosh, all this effort and it's all going to go down the tubes. So I said to her, I think we should take you to a seaweed bath and see if that helps. So we went to Kilkee and we went to one of your wonderful seaweed baths, and she did that bath, and the next day she was fine. She wasn't completely well, but she was well on her way, and she was fine to do the work we had to do. So Kilkee really saved the film.
Oh, thank you, Risha. And thank you, Risha, for being on with us today. And as we say, the Burren has such a wonderful legacy of beautiful antiquity, monastic remains in Corcoran Row Abbey, and wonderful the forts, and the whole legacy of the Burren is one of mystery and beauty. So it is, I love what you say in your film about it's a journey where we're uncovering the past and revealing and remembering those who maybe aren't in the main family tree, and bringing them back to life and giving them a vision. So Risha, thank you very much for being on with us today, and we really appreciate your time. And listeners, the Burren Girl, when is it going to, how can people go and see it? And can you tell us a little bit about that, Risha?
Yes, the film is showing at the Hotel Doolin in Doolin on the 4th of May at 8 p.m. And it's about an hour long, and then we'll have about an hour discussion. And the tickets are free with a suggested donation to Burren BO Trust, which is the brilliant eco organization that's making such a difference in
and
County
if
Clare.
people can't go to Doolin, how would they get to see the film? Can they buy it, or is it on Vimeo, or can we send the link to them?
You also can get a DVD of the film, and for that you go to a website called Burren Girl Doc, DOC, standing for documentary film, burrengirldoc.com.
Absolutely. Well, Risha, thank you very much for being on with us today. We really, really appreciate it. And listeners, what a fascinating journey Risha has brought us on, and just to show you what you can do with your family story and your family lore. So without further ado, we'll stop the recording, and we want to wish you a really good Easter, and also that our shows are podcast out, migrated over to YouTube as well. So we'll have some fine links on that. And thanks very much for listening.